for anyone who is an observer of Washington, D.C. in recent years would know the changes when it comes to China, right? So I think what's really important is the perception of the U.S. action, rhetoric, and behavior in the eyes of Beijing and China. So I think there are two important things coming from this reporting. One is I think Xi's message to Europe was that the U.S. is actually the provocateur rather than China. And then second, she understands that Europe is not entirely on the same page with the U.S. when it comes to Taiwan issues, simply because Europe doesn't have that kind of interest compared to the U.S., right? Whether it's military, economic, or politically. European countries tend to sympathize with Taiwan because of the shared values, democracy, but the core interests aren't really the same as the U.S. So I think, the takeaway from this reporting is that, first we need to understand how China views Washington, D.C.'s behavior, because oftentimes we read how D.C. thinks about Chinese behavior, right? So we need to understand what China's red lines are, what's their insecurity or what's their fear. I mean, this really says it all, in my view, by reading, what it may seem ridiculous from the eyes of the DC. However, I do think for anyone who understands sort of the long history of policy, U.S.-China relations, can understand why Beijing thinks that way.
Indeed, there are a lot of speculation. So based on the description right here, it's like Xi Jinping's warning signifies the recognition that the U.S. is using Taiwan as the leverage against China. But the State Department spokesperson immediately denied the claim. So how can this be analyzed, and what does this tell us about the stance? Like what you said, it's important not to just understand the perspective of the EU and the U.S. We also need to analyze what's the position of Beijing. So how do you see that, Professor Yu?
Well, I do think Beijing perceives, again, right, the U.S. as being provocative in when it comes to Taiwan and many other issues too. Beijing also thinks there is a belief and a theory that the West is in decline and China is rising. And so, a lot of the policies or actions, rhetoric coming from Washington, D.C. is an attempt to constrain China's rise or influence. And I think that perception is pretty prevalent among the Chinese political elites. And that, perhaps because we mostly read Western media, I mean, I think that perspective needs to be shared more, probably, so people understand how they think. Not to say, it's not to take their side or anything, but simply to know, what the perceptions are, what they're thinking, because oftentimes I think conflicts happen when each side perceives the other side as the aggressor, right? So in this case, it's pretty much the same. Each side sees the other as the aggressor. Same thing with Ukraine and Russia, even though clearly from our point of view, Russia is the aggressor. But from Putin's point of view, NATO is the aggressor.